Hey, ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start again. I think you've all had some time to grab some lunch and some coffee. We now continue with a panel of all the leaders of the main stakeholders in offshore grid development, who will be questioned by Marc van Stiphout from the Director General of Energy from the European Union, who's basically Promotion's client. Before we go into the panel, I just want to remind you that we received some during the last session on the deployment plan, and due to time reasons, we did not get to answering the questions, but we will address them one by one and get back to you after the conference on these. So I will now hand over to Marc. Marc, welcome. Thank you for being moderator. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Cees. So I'm very honored to basically moderate this panel, such a distinguished panel in such an important project. So I'm going to keep it short because there are others who have sorry. Hello, so my name is Marc van Stiphout. Very honored to chair this panel, and I'm going to shortly introduce the different speakers that we have today here, and then I think we can go straight into the discussion. So we have Søren Christensen from Energinet. Of course, I think you all know them. The Danish TSO and probably one of the champions of the world in connecting offshore wind to the grid. So certainly with a lot of wisdom that we can use today. Then we have Martin Neubert from Ørsted. Hello, and very nice to have you here as well. And I think if you then talk about connecting all these offshore wind parks to the shore, then the one who is actually building them, or one of the main ones building them all over Europe nowadays, is Ørsted. So also very nice to have you here. Then we have Ditlev Engel from DNV-Energy, the CEO, and I think Ditlev, DNV, of course, we all know you because I think every project or many projects that are being happening, and also in terms of the general discussions on offshore wind, DNV is a very important partner in many of those projects, and also for us in many of the discussions that we're having. So really great to have you here. Then we have Vera Silva, welcome, from GE, the Chief Technology Officer. So I think that we all know that offshore wind has been really pushing the boundaries of what's technologically speaking possible, and I think we will be very interested to hear from you what you're going to do further. Let's say what you have in mind, without revealing, of course, too much of the secret things that you are going to still pop out of your technology hat in the future. And then last but not least, we have Jean-Paul Dijkmans from TenneT. Welcome, Jean-Paul, and also very good to have you here. TenneT, of course, being together with Energinet, one of the main TSOs connecting offshore wind parks, and TenneT even doing that for 2 countries. And I think sometimes they would like to connect a wind park from one country to another country, and that then sometimes proves to be a bit more difficult than they would actually like to think, and in the economically optimal way doing it. But and I'm not sure if we're going to solve that in this panel discussion, but I think that also your experience in this topic is, of course, very, very much appreciated. So I would like to ask each of you to briefly introduce, from your point of view, since we are here to talk about the promotion project, to see what for you are the most important results of the project, and how they contribute to the success of your company, or how they can or should contribute to the success of your company. So I think we're going to take the same order as that I introduced the panelists. So Søren, if I can start with you.
Søren, you're unmuted. You should be able to.
Yeah, someone unmuted me now. It said on my screen that I was muted by the organizer, and that's also a way of having an efficient conference, of course. Thanks a lot for the invitation to join this panel. I'm still trying to get used to all these digital panels instead of the real ones where you can see each other, have the energy on stage. But thanks a lot for the invitation here. From my perspective, the promotion project has given us a valuable contribution in identifying technology, market, and regulatory gaps that we need to close before we are able to realize this vision of having, let's say, the Northern Seas as the power center for the Green Deal. The project shows a possible pathway to illustrate HVDC grid as we have seen in the deployment plan. I think there's a lot to do, but also I'm a bit hesitant whether we can conclude on whether we will miss actually the 2030 targets if we go for DC offshore mesh grids. You know, I think someone would at least say that part of our success as Energinet would be that we are capable of connecting 2 offshore energy islands before 2030 to the grid. So if technology has only to be developed before 2030, it could be that meshed offshore grid is not the right way of realizing the first couple of projects. Because as you know, I think some of you at least know, then the Danish Parliament agreed back in June on a new climate agreement, which says, among other things, that we need to have 2 energy islands in Danish waters, one in the North Sea, and one in the Baltic Sea, both connected before 2030. I think the technical and the regulatory knowledge gained in the promotion project, that can definitely be used in assessment on potential future development of the Danish energy islands. But I think when reading the material for the conference today, I had the feeling that we need to take a very important decision now, whether to go for AC or DC offshore. I think in addition to these things, I think that the project really shares some light on the very important aspect of anticipatory investments. And I think our success as TSOs is also defined by our ability to have grids ready at the right time. I think we have in this project have a one-eyed focus on what happens offshore, but we all know that most of the consumers, they don't live offshore, meaning that we have to connect also the onshore systems in a good way to these meshed offshore grids. And I think we need definitely to look further into how we integrate offshore and onshore in an efficient way, how we make also the technologies, the markets, and the regulatory frameworks work well together here. So I think those were my first words. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, Søren. I think that's already, putting one of the questions very, very sharply. So I think that's, from a moderator point of view, that's very much appreciated. And do we need to take an important decision now on whether to go for HVDC or AC? And so let's get back to that in a second. But first, we're going to hear what the others have to say. So, Martin, if I can ask you to share your thoughts with us.
Absolutely, thank you, Marc. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome everybody, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel. Yeah, Ørsted, we are market leader in offshore wind, and we are hugely excited about the prospects, the growth prospects of offshore wind. We all are excited to see offshore wind becoming a cornerstone and a backbone of the European Green Deal. We talk about now sort of quadrupling the capacity installed in Europe from 2020 to 2030. So moving towards 100 gigawatt in Europe, and then eventually towards 2050 to move towards up to 450 gigawatt. So we talk a lot about building more offshore wind, but we cannot build more offshore wind without building also the transmission infrastructure. So these two go hand in hand and belong together. And I'm very glad sort of that promotion is really sort of gives us a forum and a focus point on that. So in more general, we, in our view, the hybrids and the cluster connected to multiple markets, we think they are indispensable to really scaling up offshore wind. The point-to-point connection, what we call of the radio connected offshore wind farms, they can only be built out to a very limited scale, due to the onshore grid constraints in terms of number of landing points, but also sort of that we see a need to go more and more offshore. And I think in that connection, Promotion has done very important work in pushing this agenda forward and presenting sort of clear proposals on how to deploy an offshore grid in Europe. We have three sort of, from an Ørsted perspective, three important takeaway from Promotion. Number one is that Promotion proves the feasibility of the short-term project, Bornholm Island Energy Hub. Søren already talked about the two island projects that the Danish government has put into the energy agreement. We think Promotion clearly sort of promotes the point that the Bornholm idea is a concrete, tangible, near-term project, because it gives the possibility of demonstrating at full scale DC breakers and an HVDC multi-terminal onshore on Bornholm, and that's a key sort of first step in commercializing this technology. We also think it's very relevant because you know, a lot of focus has been in utilizing the North Sea as an offshore wind hub in Europe, but we and the industry wants to develop offshore wind at scale in the Baltic Sea. The second key takeaway on Promotion relates to the market arrangements. The regulatory work stream in Promotion has been very important and also helped us at Ørsted to our own thinking. I think ensuring the right market framework is as important as it is complex. Thank you for bringing up the slide here, Marc, summarizing the three key takeaways for us. And we arrive at the same conclusion as Promotion. You know, small offshore bidding zones are the necessary step, but we also need to watch out. We cannot just work without a mechanism to avoid that offshore wind becomes support dependent due to lower capture prices offshore in these small bidding zones. And then the third takeaway is that Promotion has delivered some very important groundwork in maturing controllers for power electronic converters, which enable a more efficient renewable energy integration at large scale. Furthermore, we have seen Promotion developing a testing and valuation methodology that can be used to ensure stable operation of power converters, which allows sort of an upfront de-risking of power system integration and grid code compliance. So these are sort of the three key takeaways from an Ørsted perspective of the Promotion work.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin. I think that's also, you know, very good to the point and very insightful. So Ditlev, then it's up to you to say what you have learned and how you're going to benefit from it in the future.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for organizing this. I think there's a lot of learnings, and now you only asked for a few of them. And I think first and foremost, it has really helped us together with our customers to get a much better and deeper understanding here over the last 4.5 years. What are the challenges that needs to be overcome? And you know, we every year make an energy transition outlook, and we keep maintaining that we are technology optimistic but regulatory pessimistic. And so Promotion, I think, again confirmed the opportunities that they are now on the HVDC side going forward, and what that can be is an enabler to move much faster to deal with the challenge that we all know we have on the decarbonization. So I think that has been very important. So working, and number two is really working with those 34 partners, investing in and discussing new technologies and finding new perspectives of it. And therefore maybe the fact to sit down and share across is maybe one of the very important learnings and the process in itself. of understanding how to deal with this instead of seeing it from individual camps. In its sense of bringing people together, I think has been to dare to do that and to share that, I think has been very important. And then really also then now to start to take an active role in standardization bodies, industry associations, and in order to really to promote these opportunities going forward. And so I think that the fact that we are looking at it from a technology perspective is extremely important, but also the fact that we really bring people together, not just from a power perspective, but also from a people perspective, because we know that we can only solve this if we work together across in both industries, but also borders, if this is going to be successful, because it is a massive undertaking. And I think to Martin's point, we know we have to scale this up dramatically, and therefore also I think promotion gives us, and hopefully also the regulators and others, much more confidence in being more bold, which is required in order to deliver what needs to be delivered on time. And I think this is something that this project really has given us as well. And then I will just stop here for now.
Great. Thank you very much, Ditlev. Also very good and very to the point, and also nicely responding to what Martin was saying. So next, Vera, up to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm joining here today with a double hat, not only as CTO of GE Grid Solutions, but also Vice President for Innovation of TenneT Europe. So just very briefly, TenneT Europe is the European Association of the Electricity Transmission Distribution Equipment, and we were one of the partners of the promotion project. So in terms of the main results that we are of importance for the association and the industry we represent, the first one is the deployment plan on technology innovation, which is for us something we will going to be using and promoting over the next 18 months as a dissemination plan, so that we can share knowledge with vendors and have a series of different types of webinars, events, social media, so that we increase the impact of the results of the project, and this can be kind of a lighthouse for further industry policy decisions. And the second important result for us is the findings and the work of the project did on interoperability of the DC grid systems. So the next slide, please. Yes, in terms of the importance of interoperability, so we have EU aims of climate neutrality by 2050. We can deliver from the offshore industry the required turbines, and with some with support and the right infrastructure, but we also need to have the right type of grid in order to connect this generation. And one of the things we can see is that beyond 2030 we cannot deliver this without multi-terminal HVDC systems. And today we need to have Europe's multi-terminal HVDC systems that are future-proof, and we can extend to multiple vendors. And this is why we feel that going forward and building on the work of promotion, something we're already working with ENTSO-E and WindEnergie, is that we need an EU pilot project that enables us to work in this platform in order to study how we can deliver such type of systems. So we have seen today, we have quite a lot of expertise in the technology industry in Europe. That is, we can deliver interoperable systems, multi-terminal ready, and a lot of the problems of interoperability have been successfully solved by the different HVDC suppliers. But we do need standardization of multi-vendor HVDC that can take into account the high speed of innovation that we have at the moment, as well as the implementation time required. So this is something very important for us because this will drive some changing responsibilities for TSOs as well as for vendors. Today, HVDC systems are mostly coordinated by one vendor, and in multi-vendor system, we need a leading role from TSOs to define functions on the AC and DC side. So as an industry, we're fully committed to support the TSOs in defining such functions and propose the solutions, but we do need the TSO scope in detailed specifications of what is this DC network coordination, protection functions, distributed control functions, and how to implement it in converter stations and control systems. So to sum up, we feel that interoperability of HVDC is critical to realize the vision we have for a low carbon Europe. We need domain knowledge of manufacturers to solve potential interoperability issues now, but as well as in the future. And we need the European HVDC grid code addressing the DC grid. But also, in order to have the right solutions, we feel that a pilot on multi-terminal, multi-vendor project with fast track for regulatory and financial instruments will be quite important to have manufacturers and TSOs collecting the experience we need and establishing the best practices in the design process of such systems. So we feel that a EU framework is also important as to enable the financing and the ownership and the operation of DC grids, so that we can really realize the vision that the previous speakers have already mentioned. And I'll stop here and leave the room for the discussion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Vera. Also very, very insightful and to the point, and also, you know, some clear points that you make in terms of what should happen next. So I think we can hopefully come back to that in the debate. Now, Jan-Paul, it's up to you.
Yeah, thanks, Marc. Yeah, happy to be at this panel and to share TenneT's perspective. Obviously enjoyed being part of the promotion project. Yeah, so promotion has delivered technical and non-technical support and it has advanced our ideas in how to build out a North Sea grid for connecting large-scale offshore wind, and obviously beyond the building blocks that we know today, which are the radial connections that we are now moving up to 2 gigawatt standards. And what is also a very important conclusion of promotion, that it has shown that it can work technically. So that's a very important prerequisite from that perspective. I think also a key takeaway, and that's at least a key takeaway from a TenneT perspective, is that it's very important to have real projects to drive really these kind of developments forward. Real projects in international cross-border setups with multiple stakeholders. So let me touch upon some of the results in the field of markets and regulations and energy system planning. Already in some of the earlier discussions, we saw that markets and regulations are important one to solve. Yeah, promotion has provided direction on market models and hybrid asset discussion. And as we all know, this is obviously very important in case the offshore transmission assets get more than one function, dual functions. So both used for offshore wind, farm connection, and for interconnection to facilitate cross-border trades. And as TenneT, we are happy that the Dutch government is already considering pre-investments in these kind of hybrid projects for the IJmuiden kind of offshore wind projects. So that's an important step, because without these pre-investments possibilities, it's not likely going to happen, and you don't have that window of opportunity at some stage. Yeah, secondly, promotion provided a cost-benefit analysis of a North Sea grid and specific validation of some of the analysis we did ourselves, also in the North Sea Wind Power Hub program. And promotion delivered similar conclusions as to the advantages of building larger hubs, as well as the need for coordination. Whereas all of us know and get a better understanding that especially the coordination with the onshore grid is getting more and more important, and we also need to consider basically the whole energy system. So the potential need to connecting it to storage and power to X. And thirdly, promotion has open discussion with government agencies and the EU on specific needs for longer term planning and commitment. So we need to have this longer term view, from all kind of stakeholders' perspective. So from the perspective of the vendors, offshore wind farm developers, but also the TSOs. It's something you need to do with a long-term perspective in mind. A few things to mention maybe on the technical side. Already said by my colleague John Moore before, there seem to be no technical showstoppers. Obviously, things that we need to advance there in standardization, etc. But that's an important conclusion. And promotion has engaged in real projects in order to evaluate specific solutions to specific technical problems. And this will help, this technical insight will help us to support the integration of the HVDC offshore. Some of these examples, for example, relate to DC circuit breakers. And this kind of advancements you need to take to integrate these kind of parts into the grid structures. So all in all, I would say, promotion and its work obviously supports our company in advancing, for example, the North Sea Wind Power Program that aims to connect and integrate offshore wind at large scale. And under the umbrella of that North Sea Wind Power Program, we are now really looking for real first cross-border projects that we think we need to do to drive the innovation in this kind of direction. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Jan-Paul. Also very, very good, and to the point in terms of where it has helped TenneT. So all in all, very very important results, I would think. But of course, not necessarily a neutral audience, because we would like to think that we have done well by investing this public money in the promotion project. And so let's maybe go a bit deeper into what some of the results are. So I would like to maybe split the debate up in a few different questions, actually three. One looking at specifically the technical results, one at the regulatory recommendations, and one looking at the competitiveness of the EU industry. And so how or not has promotion helped to also help the competitiveness of companies, or the efficiency of companies in the case of TenneT or Energinet, in this global market for offshore wind that is, of course, growing very rapidly. And of course, this what we are doing in Europe is maybe a bit specific, so I think that is also an interesting topic to address. But let's first start with the technical results. And there the question is, how can companies cooperate to achieve interoperability? As Vera mentioned as one of the key points, to make a future interconnected grid possible. And how do we collectively, but maybe what do the different parties, what can they do to promote cooperation, coordination, standardization? Of course, the first question is, and do you think that is necessary? But I would like to ask you, how can we achieve this interoperability between the different parts of an HVDC grid, and what can we do, or what needs to be done to ensure good cooperation? So maybe now we go backwards. So we start with you, Jan-Paul, and then we go back, let's say, in the opposite order of what we just did, if that's okay for you.
Yes, Mark, that's okay for me. Did not immediately take me by surprise. So I would like to make a couple of points here, if I can. I think first of all, and that's not per se a technical point, there is an increased role for coordination through the region and at European level. And promotion does detail the aspects in that direction. And why is it that important? In my view, it's only possible for the industry really to start moving ahead to technical standardization, economies of scale, etc. if there's a long-term outlook. And if there's a long-term outlook, yeah, we can start taking the next steps in standardization. And for the radials, obviously, that was relatively easy, although TenneT is now trying to set a new standard for 2 gigawatt connections at 525 kV. But also you need to do that if you go into the direction of mesh networks. And we also already in the first kind of projects you walk into the technical standardization questions if you are aligning with all the partners on board. It's not only the vendors, but it's obviously also the offshore wind farms. If you talk about hybrid connections, and they also look both in the short term to their what is best in the short term to have their remuneration right on their projects, and at the same time you need to have some kind of long-term perspective and the optionality for the future in mind. So cooperation is absolutely essential to implement technical solutions and to push for technical standards. And the utilization of TSO resources and combined with academic and industry kind of resources should be continued and expanded as it reduces barriers and costs. Similar initiatives like promotion. And then obviously we will also start tackling some of the challenges such as interoperability that we were already discussing earlier and that will be referred to by other panelists. One of the best things that you can do is to implement technical solutions really and advance with new standards is through real projects, in our view. You can opt for pilots, but really to have these kind of large-scale pilots, it's good to move to real projects. This is how we work with the 2 gigawatt standard. That's also how we see the future, for example, for North Sea Wind Power Hub. You need to have you need to have like a certain volume, a certain project, and then engage with all the stakeholders, the vendors, offshore wind farms, etc., to drive the standards from the technology side. And then, yeah, last but not least, so most of the projects will inevitably be cross-border. So really that cross-country cooperation will be extremely important. So to also drive standardization, you need to have some kind of regime in place that also supports and remunerates that in a way such that you can also have the long-term standardization perspective taken into account. Thanks.
Jan-Paul, can I ask you maybe one short follow-up question linked to that?
Yes,
so you mentioned your 2 gigawatt standard for 525 kilovolt. How are you, let's say, engaging with others to see if that can really become a standard?
Yeah, so we have launched a consultation in that respect with industry partners, offshore wind farms, obviously also the vendors, and we're also driving these kind of things through industry associations such as NSOE and the research and development and innovation committees over there. So a prerequisite is that that you do that in partnership with all the stakeholders in the value chain.
Okay, thanks. Good. Then Vera, what do you think?
Jan-Paul already mentioned several of the key points, so I'll build to that. So what we feel is I fully agree that we have proven the ability to have the right interoperability. If you look to the past, we see that interconnection between IFA 2000 between UK and France already has different vendors on each side of the interconnection, and its interoperability was proven at that stage. But now we're going into something more complex with the DC grid, which with much more actors between the connection towards the wind farm, how we do it cross-border. And I feel that also the control systems and the functions that we're asking from the HVDC and from the wind farms will be more complex in the future, from frequency support to grid forming. And this is why I feel that we do need industrial scale projects like what we're suggesting before, where we can have this platform for collaboration, working very closely between vendors and with the TSOs, so that we can really have best practices on the design processes, and we can define clear functional specifications that can actually allow us to develop such type of solutions that combine different vendors around the same system. So these are my key points more from the industry side on what type of collaboration we expect and how we feel we can drive innovation forward.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Ditlev, you can answer a bit to my question, but also to what Jan-Paul and Vera said in terms of how to work on the standard, for example, for the 2 gigawatt, and also, as Vera said, the need for industrial scale projects to work together. And so we don't need to, let's make it an interactive debate, even if we are far apart physically, but feel free to react to each other and not just to the question.
Yeah, so let me first say, so at DNV-GL, of course, putting things into a good standard is something that comes close to our heart. So, of course, we very appreciate of that line of thinking. And I think we have a lot of learning that, and I think it's also important to remember that when we look into what we do here in Europe, it's also important for the manufacturers that we have some standards and processes where, because offshore wind is going global now, that we also make sure that what we build into this year is something that can be scaled across the globe, and not just from because this is important for the OEMs and others who's going to manufacture the equipment, that we think along those lines as well, and not just look at North Europe as such. And then I would say from a more business perspective, the worst thing that industry knows, at least in my experience, is that when people keep changing their minds, because that makes it so normally business can live with even tough standards or regulation as long as they know that you don't keep moving the needle. So once you have decided this is what we do and we all do it, then it's very important that people don't start to change again, because that is how it drives up costs and how it makes it impossible for people to deploy capex, etc., etc. And therefore, I sincerely hope that that we, through promotion, can come to a common agreement of what the frame should look like for a long time, and then agree on that. And we can, of course, continue to debate and discuss this, for instance, in Sikow and elsewhere, but that they also on this side and with the EU becomes very clear on, then that's the way it is, because otherwise we will lose something we do not have, namely time. And of course, we will very happy to participate as and contribute as DNV-GL of how to work on best practices and standardization. But I think that's really, really the key here. And as I said in my opening remark, I would not be concerned about the capabilities of technology, but I would be very worried about the capability of deployment. And therefore, and of course, it's also about how we cooperate to make this happen. But maybe we need to spend even more time on a deployment plan, because that will be the key for the rest. And I don't know how you do that without everybody keep moving the needle, but I think that's really the where maybe you, Marc, and others in the EU make sure that that we know exactly the frame that we're working in. And then there is, and I think just because I know there's also issue around IP and how to share it, a lot of these things can be protected as well in good solutions. So I think that's also important to be aware of, that the toolbox available is much broader for how to cooperate, and also both to cooperate but without infringing IP and other issues that people, of course, also concerned about.
Thank you, Ditlev. But then can I have the maybe if I can ask you one follow-up question on that, because basically both Jan-Paul and Vera said, I mean, if I'm doing them justice, what they said, that it is through projects that you drive the standardization. Whereas I didn't hear you mention that. I think you were more talking about bringing the parties together and discuss standards. So is that because you think that the emphasis should be slightly different, or do you?
I think, well, of course, it's 3 projects, but let's also remember that for each project we deploy now, we also learn. Even the, let's say, the already planned executable projects. So for me, these are learnings, you know, like a curve that you work your way through all the time, and you take those things with you. So I think that those learnings you can keep deploying faster without changing the frame. And I think that's the key, so people know how to invest.
Great, thanks. So Martin, then I'm going to ask you, based on what Jan-Paul, Vera, and Ditlev said, are you able to say what the plans should be?
Now you should be able to hear me. I have
Yeah.
just been unmuted. Okay, great. No, so absolutely, we would actually like to see the manufacturers, so very much Vera and her colleagues, to take the lead when it comes to agreeing on the necessary open interoperability and interfacing standards. So I mean, one needs to have sort of one needs to be the driver in the discussion, and we think that should be the OEMs. But of course, you also realize this is a complex and challenging task, and we need to sort of watch out for the timelines here, because that needs to cope with the pace of actually building and developing the offshore grids. And therefore, one idea from our side is to have the TSOs and the regulators in Europe, for instance, announcing what are the requirements on interoperability for HVDC components, and that should happen in not sort of in a mid to long term perspective, but rather short term. So an idea will be 2 years from now. There's also no doubt, as the colleagues already said, more coordination is needed between all the stakeholders, whether it's the TSO, the regulators, the OEMs, the offshore wind farm developers, etc. And one platform and one sort of stakeholder involvement process to do that could be, for instance, the revision of the existing HVDC grid code to define the technical requirements for a robust system design for HVDC transmission and for the hubs that we have discussed. I think from our side, it is important that in such a revision process, we define what I would sort of call the no regret features. You know, because we don't want to put in something which gives you a very sort of narrow bandwidth and ties your hand unnecessarily. And these no regret features, I would mention a couple of them. One thing is multi-vendor accessibility and controllability, but it's also sort of the system design features for HVDC transmission. It is fault clearing strategies, and then a set of voltage levels. So I think when we say sort of interoperability is paramount, it is important, however, that we also strike the right balance when it comes to standardization of technical parameters. Yes, but as I said, we also sort of have seen how fast technological development is. And therefore we need to be sort of flexible to go with new developments. I make a concrete example for HVDC voltage levels. Currently, we should include, on the basis of current technology, 320 kV, 400 kV, 525 kV, because that corresponds to what is currently being used or will be used. At the same time, the derived parameters from that, such as power ratings, I would be very careful sort of to define a standard for that, because Jan now sort of says, and we very much like what TenneT is coming forward with, to move towards a 2 gigawatt offshore converter. But at the same time, that 2 gigawatt was only a few years back, was a 900 megawatt standard, and it, you know, we should be able sort of to grow with time. And one of the key things is, to the comment I made in the beginning, is we need to build more and we need to build faster, and therefore sort of we shouldn't limit ourselves to what we currently see as a standard. We need to build in that flexibility.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. So then, Søren, my question for you would be, based on what the previous speakers have said, and what came out of promotion, is that sufficient to bring, let's say, as he says, TSOs and regulators, but I think that also requires the, let's say, the equipment manufacturers to sit together and to see what the HVDC requirements should be. Is there a sufficient of a basis to come up with, for example, identifying the things that should be defined together and the things that you should not define because they will still develop in the future, and not defining them doesn't hinder building the offshore grid, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, indeed I do. I think the key words here from a TSO perspective is that we need to do this in a way where we can have interoperability, which has already been mentioned already, and then the modularity. I'm pretty much in line with the speaker saying, okay, we can probably not do a very blueprint design of all the building blocks right now. So if your question is whether we have that basically out of the promotion project, that blueprint design, or whether we can make it out of what we have, I think we cannot. So we need to have some kind of a flexible approach here, because yeah, it is extremely important. I think from a TSO perspective, I think what is lacking here is perhaps a bit more on the risk profile of this. And I'm also talking about financial risks, but also very much stability risks in the system. Because one thing is, if such a major offshore grid really trips, then you can have a blackout in Northwestern Europe or potentially even wider. And what is the risk profile actually when we start deploying industry scale components, which we have not really tested, and where our existing models of simulations perhaps does not really give us all the answers of how they will react in different scenarios of electrical faults. We have had a couple of incidents, the UK one as being one of them, where stability issues in the grid is quite much in the forefront of my thinking when we talk about how to build this. Because if we need really politicians and citizens to support that we should still do a rapid green transition, and we need them to support that, obviously, we will need to stay safe also in terms of stability in these systems. So yeah, we should be bold. I think previous speaker said we should be bold. We should more or less test full scale. Yes, I'm also with you on that one, but we should also have a more eye on the risk profile. What can actually go wrong here? And then also from the financial perspective. So I think that was at least some of my notes from the previous speakers and what you are saying here.
Great. Thanks a lot. Ditlev, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I just want to maybe just share a small story from 10 years ago, because I think it's also about mindset. And I participated 10 years ago in a conference just after the major oil spill from BP down in the Mexican Gulf. And at that time, the former CEO of BP shared the innovation rate at BP before and after the oil spill. And the innovation after the oil spill reached a level that BP had never ever seen before of what they could develop when they had to. And he said in his presentation that if he asked his R&D people to deliver that performance before the oil spill, everybody said we cannot do that. But when the oil spill happened, they could. And that was one of their positive learning from a very, very difficult situation where you really have to. So my point here is coming back to when we address about how to get this deployment going and that is being talked about. Maybe it's a question of, instead of going, what are we going to do in 21, 22, 23? Maybe it's a question of saying, this is where we need to be in 2030 or 2035, whatever. That's what needs to have there. Then we have to start to work our way backwards and say, what do we then need to have by when and how fast, and what are then the options to execute based upon that? Because we have a tendency to work on a plus model instead of saying, if we got to get all this to happen, like in the EU Green Deal, what needs then to happen in 2021 already? So because I think it would put a tremendous pressure on the necessary work and innovation rate required if we're going to catch the climate and the Paris aspirations. So I think we need to work on all the technical side, but I think we also need to work differently because otherwise we can't execute at the speed that is required.
Okay, thanks, Ditlev. This last question that you put, if we reason back from 2030, what should we do now? Let's park that, because that I think that's a nice one as the final question. But now I would like to, we were talking about the technical, and of course we went into also what this means for the regulations, because the regulations also address some of the technical requirements. So maybe to build a bit on what Søren was saying about the risks, as anybody who has ever dealt with the stock market will say, with risks you need to talk about rewards. So how do we, if we talk about the regulatory requirements for a second, and the regulatory recommendations coming out of promotion, then building on what you said, Søren, we also need to look at the risks. So how do we make sure that in the investments that are needed in the offshore grid, and there is a possibility to take a forward-looking approach and maybe take some risks, but also make sure that there is an adequate reward, that the distribution of benefits is properly fair, and the distribution of benefits, cost, risks in the investments in the future offshore grid, because they are by definition longer term projects. So how do we make sure that we can organize those? How can we find the balance between those key criteria, I think, that need to be met for anybody to be able to invest in this, in particular from the network point of view. Right, and now I should say who, and because Søren, you brought it up more or less, we just go back. It's you. Please go ahead, Søren.
Yeah, I can share a few words. I don't know if my previous intervention sounded like I thought we had a lot of time. I do actually not think so, but I think it would be very wise to not build in, let's say, systemic risk into our design here. If we build in a risk profile into the system that can make the entire project collapse, I think that would be definitely wrong. So I think we should have a very good idea very fast on where are the crucial design features where we need to avoid these systemic risks. Some of it can be very sophisticated, but some others could be less sophisticated. I remember a case where I think the first couple of gigawatts of PV in southern Germany, they all had the same frequency sensitivity setting, meaning that if the frequency was a little bit off, you would lose 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 gigawatts of PV in southern Germany instantaneously, and you will bring the complete grid down. This was completely stupid, because you could just have different settings here and you would protect the system better. So I think from a TSO perspective, I think it's pretty it's fair to expect us to work faster with grid codes, with system operation guidelines, but going into this territory without having those things in place, I think we will go with a too much unknown risk profile.
Great, thanks. But then my question would be, if with promotion we, or you, have found or have been able to identify what those key design features are that you need to address in order to avoid systemic risk. So maybe for that, now we're going to do it a bit random. Maybe Jean-Paul, you want to say something? And you can also answer, of course, this general question on the benefits and costs to enable the longer-term investment in the grid.
Yeah, I have to say the question on the systemic risk is quite a difficult one. It's obviously one we need to take in mind. On the other side, and I'm not a technician, I have to say, we have been able to deal with all these kind of elements before. So this is not something that we should not be able to solve. We are dealing with large amounts of integration of renewables and solar in our system, and days that there's more renewable energy in the system than before. But obviously, if we move to bigger connections like 2 gigawatt, etc., then we need to know the effects on the energy system if there's indeed a failure in these kind of connections, which are potentially bigger failures than we know today. I will leave it at that because I will probably explore some territories that I don't know as I don't have this technical background to address some of these things. But maybe the other panel members will address that in a bit more detail. I already see one of the other ones nodding, so Vera will probably add something there.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Vera, for raising your hand. So please go ahead.
So if I may, so I fully agree with Soren pointing out that creating a mesh DC grid is integrating quite a lot of new technology into the grid, as well as operating it in a complete different configuration from what we have built experience over the last years on DC interaction with AC networks. And that's while we're also asking to some of these new technologies to provide services to the grid to help the stability, frequency regulation, voltage regulation. So from our experience more than in GE, what we can see is that designing these systems is quite complex. And as we work with the offshore teams, trying to think of how we can even design the full system end to end from the offshore, that there's quite a lot of issues on the interoperability of the control systems and avoiding unwanted interactions. So as I agree as well, as we go into grid codes, I think it's important that we work together on understanding these interactions, quantifying these risks, which can be mitigated if we have the right technical work behind it, so that we can then set basically the rules that will help us to understand the risk and to reduce it. But I fully see this as a really a growing domain where the industry needs to work together.
But Vera, if I may follow this up with a short question, then so do I understand correctly that promotion may have helped to identify some of those things, but it hasn't. It's not enough to identify what those key design features are, and do I also hear you say that it's not enough just to discuss that, let's say, in a theoretical way, that it requires testing?
I think by setting the promotion has opened several roads and several points, like the importance of interoperability of the systems. At the same time, I can see that as we move forward into putting this, going into the deployment and even testing further these systems, that we're going to see that controls will be quite complex from a technical perspective. And if we do not master this, we are really incurring risks in terms of the stability and the security of the system that could, as Soren said, compromise basically the acceptance we have to the technology. So we cannot rush into a grid code without having actually done a lot more work between the different players to understand how we're going to work this interoperability and controls coordination in future. I'm going into quite technical details, but I think when we're looking at integrating such new technology and operating it in these new ways, the devil is in the details.
Yeah, and I think promotion was also that type of project. Yeah. So from my point of view, that's fine. And I'm a moderator, so I can just kind of nod intelligently and ask a somewhat intelligently sounding question as a follow-up without pretending that I understood everything in full detail. In this case, my follow-up question would actually be to Martin, because I can imagine that you will be kind of at the receiving end of those risks to some extent. And so what do you think of this discussion? Is it because on the one hand we say, you said we need to develop the code, but I also hear Vera saying before we are able to develop such a code, we need some further work and insights. So I can see those things from a wind park developer, impatient as they are by definition, seeing as a bit of a worry. So what's your
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Marc. And I think sort of that was the main headline of your question was sort of what are the regulatory recommendations. And I think maybe 2 points here from my side, which are, we believe, quite fundamental, not only sort of for the European Green Deal, but more sort of specifically for the ongoing offshore renewable energy strategy work that is currently going on in process. So point number one is that market models for offshore grids and hybrid assets have to be basically to deliver the right investment incentives in order to ensure that we see an efficient and sufficient build out of the transmission grids. And I think we need to realize that the current EU electricity framework basically treats assets either as a transmission or as generation assets, and therefore sort of the current framework cannot be applied to hybrid assets, which is basically a combination of the two. I think that's a very, very important sort of understanding and takeaway. And if we just sort of say, well, let's anyway apply the rules that we currently have to also sort of the hybrid assets, then we would basically end up in absurdity. Because as an offshore wind farm generator, we could be curtailed to give way for electricity trade on a transmission line. But curtailing offshore wind is not the idea behind unleashing the potential of offshore wind for a Green Deal in Europe. Then some have sort of suggested, how can we sort of solve this? Maybe we need to rediscuss the rules that basically govern cross-border trades. But we don't think that's the right way either, because we need to sort of maximize the trade between borders to integrate markets and to fully use the renewable electricity. So what promotion has identified, and we fully sort of concur to that, is to suggest that we need to create these small offshore bidding zones. We think that's a good solution, but it cannot just stand alone. Because we would create another potentially even bigger sort of challenge. Because in offshore bidding zones, there is no demand, and that means that prices will align with the lowest connected price area. And reducing market income for offshore wind generators, again, with no one sort of is going to invest on the basis of such a hypothesis. So that's why we think it's important we solve this, and we have to reconsider the way revenue is being distributed for offshore wind hybrid assets that can basically sort of simultaneously generate and transmit. That's a very, very, very important regulatory agenda point, and as said, we need to take this up as part of the offshore renewable energy strategy. The second point I would make is how do we enable sort of these anticipatory investments that take future development of offshore wind into account. So on the one hand side, we see the regulators, they have the necessary mandate to consider the need to deliver the net zero by 2050. But we also sort of need to look at the EU, who plays a very important role in de-risking such investments with necessary funding schemes, whether it's through loans or whatever other sort of models to basically enable these, especially initial projects. And then I'm back sort of what could be tangible initial projects, and we see, for instance, the island ideas in Denmark, especially the Bornholm idea, because you use an existing infrastructure as something which is tangible and short term.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin. That I think was also very much to the point. I saw Jan-Paul nodding enthusiastically, and I saw Ditlev raising his hand. So maybe Jan-Paul, you want to say something about this regulatory dimension and on the one hand the issue of hybrid assets and how you view that from a TSO point of view, and this issue of anticipatory investments.
Yeah, when Martin started, I almost anticipated he was going to be very much against offshore bidding zones, etc. But I think that was not the message he was bringing, and I'm quite happy about that. I think the key message that he is bringing is that we say these hybrid assets, they bring socioeconomic benefits. We see that they are more beneficial than assets with only one function offshore. But ultimately, of course, there needs to be a balance for all the stakeholders in the chain. If that, for some reason, we organize it because we have lagging regulation, etc., it will have it will be detrimental, for example, for the offshore wind farm developers. Then that's something we need to understand and further explore. And I at least can acknowledge that we need to have a good look at that, because otherwise it's not flying. If it's not flying for one of the critical parties in the chain that is supporting basically to make hybrid transmission offshore a possibility, then that's also something, an interest that we need to take into account. Yeah, maybe then on the moving a bit broader on regulation. I think first the starting point, of course, is that that there's broad consensus that we need to have significantly more offshore winds. That the projects we need to develop need to be larger because we need to keep the system affordable. It needs to have dual functions, the offshore grid. And I think we also inevitably understand that these projects need to become cross-border and thus involve multiple stakeholders, more stakeholders than we know today, governments, regulators, offshore wind farms, TSOs, now, you name it, all kinds of players. And I think that in itself makes it more complicated for us, because we tend to start discussing things from the more nationally oriented systems as we know them today. But in my view, at least for the North Sea, we should be able to solve that. It should not be too difficult to solve it, in my view at least. There are not too many countries surrounding the North Sea. We should take the government should take a more cooperation perspective to explore the offshore wind to move really to the next phase of cross-border projects in that perspective. So you need a European roadmap, or at least you need regional roadmaps to drive these kind of things forward based on international cross-border cooperation between governments, TSOs, and then obviously in consultation with the older stakeholders. A second important thing is that we already know now with the radial connections and the offshore infrastructure that we need to develop, that we already need to start aligning now with the infrastructure on land to prevent massive congestions in the onshore grid. So also that perspective, we cannot push that away for this is something we need to consider now. And we need to consider it now because the lead times of developing the infrastructure are at least 10 years. And we know when we have all the radials basically in place around 2030, the question about storage power to X is there. So that is something we need to take into account into this these valuations as well that we are making. So from that perspective, you need to have an enabling framework. You need to have a clear remuneration framework for all the parties in the system. You need harmonization and clear rules. So that's and you need to have the opportunity for some early investments to test these kind of optionalities such that we can move from radial to hybrid solutions. So we would really welcome it very much that, for example, in corporations like the North Sea Energy Corporation, etc., we start thinking in how do we make these kind of cross-border kind of projects work, where the offshore industry is represented and also the TSOs are involved.
All right, thanks, Jan-Paul. Ditlev, I think you also wanted to say something to this, so go ahead.
It was maybe a point made a few minutes ago, just very brief. In our daily life, we see that sharing data is not easy. And if we're going to be successful here, we would need to bring both the OEMs, TSOs, and so on together, and really get to the bottom of the data. And so I think to think more around those lines and also much more holistically about the entire system is going to be very, very important. But we also understand, of course, the issue about IPR, etc., etc. But it can be done, but it may need to be rethinked. And therefore, just to Søren's point about, should we have a new grid code in place? Maybe we should agree on a date when it has to be in place. Because I think that would maybe spearhead innovation on all sides of the table, but just as a concrete suggestion of how we move faster to the next level, because I think we all agree that speed is important here. But I think we just remember that some of the dynamics in society at the moment is actually counterproductive for speed.
Great, thank you, Ditlev. I like the ambition. So maybe going to the next question. What does this mean for the EU industry, or for the industry that is in Europe? Because I think officially how you would qualify them is maybe a bit of a tricky discussion that I think we can work around with if we just say that this is about an industry that employs a lot of people in Europe, including in and other companies that are doing very well in this segment of HVDC technologies. So I think, of course, my first question would be to Vera and also to Martin, how promotion and the things that come out of this and the things that we've been discussing just now help or not your international competitive position. And then maybe I would like to hear maybe from Søren also how you see this, if this is anything that is where there's also a role for TSOs, or how you see your role there. And I would the last word to Ditlev on this as somebody who talks to companies all over the world. So and looks into their books, but he doesn't need to tell us any secrets about that. So Vera, you first, please.
Thank you, Marc. And it's indeed on the offshore and the HVDC industry. The focus of GE and the employees is Europe. So we definitely are very much a European player there. So, and this is why promotion and other projects we've been involved have been quite important, because I feel the competitiveness for us today, European industries, that we do have a lot of technology experience already we built. But at the same time, you need to bring new technology quite quickly into the system. Things like the DC circuit breaker that we were looking within the promotion, and the capability at the moment to invest, it's quite a challenge to invest in R&D and new technology development. So the results of the projects such as promotion have definitely helped us to share the risk of investing in new technology. So just to sum up, what we feel is that as we're looking into 2020 and beyond, which is kind of the time scale I look a lot as a R&D leader, is that we need to start deploying 20 gigawatt per year offshore, and we need to get both the AC and the DC connections, depending on the project, and reduce their cost. So what sometimes lacks today is to have for us a clear and more stable policy vision on what needs to be done by when will we have the grid code or the rules, so that we can prepare the right pipeline, being that in investments on new technology or as well as across the supply chain and resources. So this is one of the first the challenges I would like to bring forward, and building on everything we learn from what we do in projects like promotion into how we move and how we make choices and priorities to go into industrialization of a product that actually has a market and brings the profitability we need to see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Martin, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would basically take that question, Marc, from the angle of growth and the growth perspective. Again, sort of, if you look at the massive growth opportunity in European offshore wind, and related to that, the massive growth opportunity in offshore grids, I think I see more and I would highlight more the opportunity than the threats for European industries. I think Europe has the best chance here, not least sort of through the work of promotion, but also this forum as we discussed it here, to really set the global standard, ensure interoperability, what we just discussed, drive down costs, and scale up a completely new industry where Europe can be a champion. When you look sort of what has happened on the offshore wind development side, it is, fortunately, we see offshore wind in the meantime becoming really a global industry. And when you look who is championing it, who is championing offshore wind in North America and in Asia Pacific, it's the European industries, it's the European developers, because we had sort of that lead time to gain the experience here in Europe by coming back to being bold, investing into something new, and I see the same can happen here on the grid side. So really, and especially on HVDC. So really, I see more an opportunity than a threat. I would absolutely sort of warn against how can we sort of become and make this industry more protective, and what about local content rules and local content regulation? Should we sort of simply structure that through a regulatory framework? I clearly sort of have an issue with that. I would rather see a very competitive European HVDC industry that is sort of globally leading and setting the standard and the pace, rather than to debate local content rules and how can we ourselves sort of protect from the rest of the world.
Fully agree.
Thanks. Ditlev, what's your view?
Yeah, I think Vera and Martin said most of it. The only thing that I will add is that we make every year our energy transition outlook forecast, and we base it upon price. And I think it's very, very important to remember that this industry, in our opinion, at the moment, is at the end of the beginning. When you look at the forecasted opportunities that there are related to development of the electrification of societies, also very much driven by offshore wind, but not just offshore wind, but electrification overall, then it's really true that we should, again, coming back to the mindset, at least when we look at our numbers, our view is really that we are at the end of the beginning. And that means that scaling and how to scale fast is the key here. And the only way that we can really scale fast is also we work with other industries, like, for instance, maritime spatial planning as an example, the role of ports, etc. And I think that's the real exciting opportunity here, that it is much broader across industries than what we see at the moment. And therefore, I think, again, coming back to the way we need and the mindset we need to approach this has to be different. And that is a global phenomenon. This is it will grow a lot in Europe, but to Martin's points, it will grow a lot in a lot of other places. So I fully share the view that this is a growth opportunity that we need to handle here.
All right, thanks. And maybe, I don't know, Søren, if you want to say something about what your look is at this competitiveness dimension of this industry.
I think, and I think that echoes very well what previous speakers have said. I think the main competitiveness is to avoid bottlenecks, basically, because I think this market would grow at a pace where it would really be needed to be able to scale the businesses also in Europe. And I think from a TSO point of view, it's crucial for us to have an efficient and competitive market for technology solutions, but also something with interoperability. And I think Martin will share that view as a customer, and also Jean-Paul, of course. So I think, yeah, having a market here without too many bottlenecks is important.
And basically, interoperability is one of the bottlenecks. Right?
Yeah, but interoperability is also, I think, a way to avoid a bottleneck, because this means that okay, if you have started out in a modular setup with an energy island with one vendor, and then this vendor has its order book full for the next 7 years, you do not need to stop your projects, because you can go into market with these more generic specifications where you can add modules from other vendors. So I think, once again, industry standards are key here.
And let's say the big Chinese technology providers in this segment already calling you, or not yet?
I think we are also talking with suppliers from outside Europe. Yeah.
Good, or not good, but at least important. No, I mean, good or not good, no judgment. I mean, right. So I think with that we can come to the last point, which is you know what I think. My question would have been, what is the biggest challenge ahead in terms of the offshore, the ambitions we have for offshore? And I think you know, Ditlev, the way you phrase it, I quite like that. What if we see where we need to be in 2030, and in particular, if we are going to step up our ambition in terms of CO2 emission reduction to 55% by 2030, as opposed to 40, because we think that is a more gradual trajectory to 2050, because having looked at our scenarios, it put a lot of weight and a lot of effort, let's say in the last 10 years from 2040 to 2050, also in offshore wind. And with this 55% objective of CO2 emission reduction in 2030, we try to make it in a way more gradual, but of course it means stepping up our efforts now a lot more. And so what do you think the most important thing to do now is, if we think of where we need to be in 2030? And of course, I'm not going to say that you can only mention one thing, but let's make it as concrete as possible in terms of what and by who and when is basically 2021 and 2022. So with that, maybe Vera, you go first. And then we'll go for every individual of you to basically have your say on this. And maybe, you know, you can of course also say some closing point if you want, but please keep it a bit short. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll focus on rather the opportunity we see to meet this 450 gigawatt offshore. So from a technology provider perspective, we focus on what can we do to reduce the cost of developing these projects and of ownership of the projects, and remove the bottlenecks we see on the scale up of the technologies. So just take two examples. One of the things is looking at how we can design a system that includes both the wind farm up to the connection to the grid, and how we can use different digital service solutions to significantly reduce and facilitate the maintenance cost for the industry. And of course, in terms of the bottlenecks, we often face the access to ports, having the right type of ships, having all the infrastructure around that basically speeds up and facilitates the construction. And I think that it's quite important that we start relentlessly working as an industry on removing those bottlenecks so that we can actually deliver this ambitious target of offshore.
Great, thanks a lot, Vera. I think that was very, very clear. Jan-Paul, what's your view?
Yeah, just one important point that I would like to bring forward is that we need a political commitment now for the projects that we need in 10 or 15 years time. So for me, that is the most important point. Their cooperation should be the first priority. We need to reach agreements amongst EU member states or states around the North Sea, such that really the ramp up that Ditlev was talking about can take place. So that is something that you cannot wait for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You need that this or next year. You need to see the steps for these kind of commitments. And for these kind of commitments, for example, TenneT is inviting amongst others, the German, Danish, and Dutch governments to jointly work on an outline of a first cross-border offshore wind project together with the relevant partners at this scale. And then we're thinking about having a first view on a project of around 12 gigawatts that also fits then with the plans that we're already seeing in Denmark, Germany, like the Danish energy island that was already described by Søren. So really political commitment is necessary now.
Martin, so does this sound to you like music to your ears that you think will is needed?
Yeah, no, it does, because we say in offshore, you know, we need to get our feet wet, and by you know, we have talked a lot. More talks are needed, more coordination, more cooperation is needed, but we also need to get going, and that's why we need sort of these early projects, which are not just sort of, you know, a vision around 2030 or beyond 2030. And back to the energy islands, I mean, the Danish state has set a framework. There's a clear sort of tender timeline for 2023, a clear timeline sort of to bring these projects into operation before 2030 towards 2028. But we need to get going, and there's a lot also the European Commission and the EU can help sort of to get them on their way. More in general, sort of when it comes to the European Green Deal and what the offshore wind developers industry is sort of often discussing as the major pain point, it is really sort of maritime spatial planning. I would mention sort of 3: maritime spatial planning. We need to find the space to build the offshore wind farms, and there needs to be an honest discussion with policymakers and regulators on the one hand side of protecting the climate, because for that we build more offshore wind farm, but then there's also many other interests, including sort of protecting the nature. And I don't think this is a trade-off, but currently sort of the way this is handled also by different policymakers, it looks very much like a trade-off, but it shouldn't be. So maritime spatial planning is a key issue for us. Then building bigger and faster. I mean, you know, we have basically developed an industry in Europe that is able to build 3,000 to 4,000 megawatt a year. We need to double that until 2025, and from 2030 onwards, if we want to live up to the European Green Deal, it means we need to sort of step further up to 20 gigawatt build out a year. But we need sort of that operational roadmap to get there. It's nice sort of to discuss the targets on paper, and it's good to see the governments you know, committing to these long-term targets, but that's just not just enough. We need sort of a clear roadmap and how to get there. And then the last thing is sort of the risk-sharing mechanism. Again, a major pain point currently, big discussions ongoing, for instance, in Germany. Because we need to sort of realize that you know, decarbonizing Europe, decarbonizing industry, decarbonizing the entire energy sector will have a major influence the way how electricity prices are set, and therefore when politicians sort of say market price risk is something that developers should take, I think that's quite dangerous, because it is not a market price risk, it is to a large extent a regulatory risk. And therefore we need sort of to appreciate instruments, and we have the instruments, and I'm now talking about the two-way CFD. We have the instrument, it is proven. We see it in the UK, we see it in Italy, we see it in France. Poland is going to use it. So many of the European markets have adopted that instrument, but there are some markets, Denmark also to mention as a positive example, but there are some markets where politicians have a hard time to adopt it. In Germany, the discussion is ongoing in Germany right now. So risk sharing mechanism is the third point I would mention.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. Ditlev, over to you.
A lot has been said. The only thing I would say here is that number one, we haven't talked about NIMBYism and all the challenges there is on deployment. And if this got to be driven from the top, so it's got to be something that is agreed by EU heads of state, not just on the 55% target, but also the speed of deployment. Because with the current rules in place in Europe, it will be impossible. So you need to decouple some of the current regulation in order to go fast enough. So I would say that everybody who is really focusing on the need for decarbonization, we all have to give way in order to make sure that the necessary measures can be done to get it implemented, because that is going to be the key. It is not, as I said before, from our point of view, it is not a technology challenge. It is much more a deployment challenge. And there are many rules and regulation outside the energy industry which are working against the speed of deployment. And that can only be solved from the top. So I think it would be, my recommendation would be to put forward what is needed by when in order to make sure that deployment can happen fast enough. And to that point of the scaling, it also means how do we use digital tools and others to do it much faster. If you look at how fast we built the first offshore wind farm compared to how fast we do them today, those kind of learnings need to be built in as well, so that you can scale at a complete different pace than today. And that will be the only way.
Thank you. Søren, are you confident enough to still add wisdom to everything that was already said?
At least I think I can offer a different perspective or an additional perspective, because Martin said just a few minutes ago that we needed to get our feet wet. I think you mentioned that. And I think my perspective here is that we need to get our feet dry, meaning what happens offshore when we talk about deployment and the speed of deployment of 300 to 400 gigawatts of offshore wind, we also need some demand. Because it's not enough to produce cheap energy. We need to have a value of energy in a way of using it. So that's where, and I think also to combine with Ditlev's perspective on NIMBism, we need to transport it across Europe. We need to convert it in large-scale industrial facilities to hydrogen, and perhaps further on to other power-to-X fuels. So we need not to forget the demand side. We will not succeed with the deployment because it simply makes no sense if we don't have a demand side working. Power-to-X is a major part of that equation, but we also need power infrastructure across Europe, and it's not too popular, I should add. So please, I think having this two sides of equation, remember it's not only about cost out on the production side, it's also about getting value of the energy on the other side. So let's go for that, because else we will end up, and I think that is one of the major risks, we will end up in a stop and go situation. Because one thing is stop and go from a political point of view, there can be stop and go from a technological point of view if we have big incidents, and we can have even stop and go if the market breaks down because we have no demand and therefore the prices collapse. So I think those are the three key areas where I would think we should also be well aware of the challenges.
Thanks, Martin. I saw you want to ask the floor, but if you don't mind, we're going to end here, because in any case, I wouldn't want to give anybody the impression that this is the last discussion we're going to have about this. And so we need to keep talking about this. I think that is the most important conclusion of today, where the individual, let's say, network operator or wind park or technology supplier perspective is not enough to make this happen. And I think what you mentioned, or some of you mentioned, that we need to look also beyond the offshore wind parks and the grids into the demand on the one hand. So how do we integrate it onshore? And we need to look at how all these things that you are building fit into the sea, and let's say make sure that the fishermen also see some benefit in offshore wind turbines. So this discussion needs to happen and needs to continue and needs to happen in a kind of an intensive way. You are no doubt aware that we are preparing an offshore energy communication for later this year, where we will try to address the points that you mentioned. I would be surprised if after this communication you would see, good, this is fine, then we can stop worrying. And I would not recommend you to stop worrying, because I think because of the challenge we have, let's say I would be very worried if you are not worried anymore. So I think we need to continue working together. We need to really put our efforts there. I think if you look at the offshore industry, what it has achieved over the last years, what it has achieved in Europe, it's phenomenal. So we can be confident that we can do these things. I think we have achieved, major cost reductions, a major build out of offshore wind parks, connecting them, that I think 10 years ago many people would not have thought possible. So I think we can be proud of that and confident that we can handle the future, but it's not a given. I think we need to step up even more those efforts that we've taken before. And I think with our offshore communication that will come out, we will try and give it that push and support you in all these things that need to happen. Of course, I will not try to wrap everything up in conclusions that then also wrap up the debate, because as I said, I think that is not the goal of this discussion. I hope we have inspired many people who have listened in to basically get engaged and work on this and work harder on this. I think there are the dimensions of looking broader at it, getting the political engagement, looking at the planning, looking also at concrete projects, whether they are cross-border projects or projects that really look into demonstrating some of the key dimensions of the technologies, as well as looking at the risk profile, the risk reward, and the benefit and cost distribution to look beyond individual projects, and the grid code as one of the key issues that you mentioned. So I think, you know, this in no way does justice to the richness of the debate, but I think these were kind of some of the main elements that you mentioned. And so before we end the session, I would also, on behalf of my colleagues, both in the unit and in INEA, thank everybody who was involved in the promotion project, because I think that it was an extremely timely project, an extremely important project that has also helped us in identifying some of the key issues for the offshore communication that we are working on. So thank you all for doing that, and also thank in particular my colleague Mariana Sancheva at INEA, who has been working with all of you to bring promotion to a good end. So thanks a lot for this session, thanks a lot for this discussion. But as I said, I hope nobody assumes that now it's over. We need to continue and step up, and I hope we will see more of each other in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marc.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Marc. And thank you very much.
Over to you. Thank you.
Panelists. Yes. I think that was a very insightful discussion and very nice contributions, and definitely an important first step on the way towards coordination between different stakeholders, led by the EU. So thank you very much for that. I hope that based on the discussions that we've been listening to, the people in the audience now also have been able to make up their opinion a little bit. And in order to gauge that, we have put together yet another poll. Jochen, can you bring the poll to the foreground? What do you think should be the next step now? Or maybe more importantly, who do you think should take the next step? Should it be the developers? Should they also be allowed to build and operate transmission infrastructure and let the market take care of the rest? Should EU ministers get together to draft a common vision for the rollout? Or should the EU create a EU-wide TSO that then builds an optimized plan for the North Sea grid and executes this? Or do you think that the TSO should come together and agree on technical standards, like, for example, the voltage level and requirements for interoperability that will enable the future compatibility? Or do you think that this should be done by the HVDC manufacturers? Please let us know how you see this.
And the answers are rolling in.
Of course, not an easy question, especially not after so many interesting inputs from our panel.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest. There's still answers coming in, so I'll give it a little bit longer.
Right. Are we still getting new answers, or have people made up their minds?
Yeah, I think by now everybody has made up their mind. Oh no, there was one additional coming in. One more. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, get your votes out. Okay, I think this is it. Let's close the poll and share the results. 1 second, I will share my screen.
Yeah.
And here we go.
Well, I think that's a very interesting result. Definitely, people don't think that it should just be left up to the market. And surprisingly, there's a majority that seems to be of the opinion that the EU should create a TSO that will then build out an optimized plan for the North Sea grid. I think that's a very interesting result, and that also nicely builds up to the next part of the day for our last speaker, Laurent Schmidt from ENSOE, the body which of course represents all of the EU TSOs and therefore comes closest to being a European TSO. Laurent, welcome. Thank you for wrapping up our conference today. With the results of that poll in mind, how do you see the vision for the future of offshore grid development in the EU?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me today. Can you hear me well, Cornelis?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Yes. Okay, thanks. So I think thanks for inviting me. I listened to the previous panel, which was extremely interesting. I prepared a few slides, which is actually summarizing our ENSOE position when it comes to offshore grid development. And I think you will hear that it's very much basically connecting with the previous statement made. Am I supposed to show myself the screen, or are you going to show it?
You show it. If you have it ready, then.
I am not. No, I don't have it ready right now. So we'll take.
Oh, I can take over that. Don't worry. Give me a second. I will share my screen. You just let me know when you need to advance the slides.
Yes. So if we go to the slide number 2.
1 second.
Yes. So basically, we have produced, as what I said, several position papers recently on how we think we should develop this next offshore grid system. As what we heard just before, we think that there is a need for a step change in the speed to implement that, with over 170 gigawatts to be integrated in 2040 around the North Sea. So that represents a huge quantity of wind, and reminding that, of course, load centers are not in the middle of the North Sea. So it's very important, as what we just heard before, to think the consequence and the impact it has on the rest of the mainland system. We also think that it is very, very important to coordinate the planning of the development of offshore and onshore system, considering the whole system benefits. So the TSOs in ENSOEs have started to work from that perspective in the context of the next 10-year network development plan, where we are analyzing system needs in various areas of Europe. A recent report was produced on that. And we also think that the TSOs have a key role in working in the coordination of the operation of the large mesh and hybrid system, which will be resulting. And I think what we heard just before from Soren is very interesting, is we should not forget the consequence and the impact of this new system on the resilience of the system as a whole. If we go to the following slides, it's very important, as what we heard, to establish a proper regulatory framework to be able to do that. We also heard it into the discussion. It is important to have cooperation between member state TSO and all stakeholders. So I think the key is holistic one system approach and providing visibility to investor. Having consistent unbundling rule for on and offshore system, which ensure neutrality, non-discrimination, fair competition, and security of supply. So particularly related to the development of these new offshore hybrid assets, which are going to be jointly used by the offshore developers, but also for cross-border flow optimization. and of course the setting up of forward-looking and anticipatory investment through proper and compatible from different member states. So we heard a lot about de-risking the first large-scale investments, and while staying compliant with all what happens in the context of the clean energy package, and particularly the rule related to capacity allocation and congestion management on the broad system. So getting a holistic view here in terms of market design and stable investment is absolutely key. And of course, our markets committee, system operation committee, and system development committee have been taken as key input all the outcomes of promotion as I would say as a way forward to think this future development, and basically which are well summarized in this position paper. So if we go to the next slide, it is more onto the implication on the innovation and interoperability. So as what we heard, the interoperability itself is absolutely essential. So our research and innovation committee once again took over the input from the project and started to think on how to accelerate, how to further develop large-scale flagships into the direction of what we learn from promotion, and basically trying out the theory of standardization into real project. This is very important, and doing the needed integration. The need to do stepwise development. So in view of the various projects which gets developed, agreeing on where to mesh these grid architecture in order to basically guarantee the right level of security margin into the system. So apparently this Bornholm Island is a very interesting area to particularly look at, listening from the past. And then what we also heard is very fundamental to do all the necessary system in order to ensure that the system which get built offshore here does not have any impact on the reliability level of the main system, and that we develop it within acceptable risk mitigation. So here, what is very important in our research and innovation committee is to take the lesson learned from promotion and other projects and complement what exists in terms of grid code, such as the ENSOE HVDC code, which is, I would say, so far has not been too widely used, but now with this development of mesh system, the usage of such code is becoming obvious. And of course, this requires to be refined, further tuned, so that basically TSOs and vendors all together can make efficient use of it through the next project phase. So that's in a nutshell basically the recommendation which have been given for a paper. And once again, our community is working now very hard into building up the next stage of large-scale flagship to be able to move this concept into closer to the industrial phase. So these were the final few inputs I wanted to add to the very interesting panel discussion just before.
Thank you, Laurent. I think those conclusions and recommendations also align very well with the conclusions and recommendations that come out of promotion. With that, I would like to come to the end of this conference. It's been our pleasure to share our results with everybody here, with all the stakeholders that hopefully were present during this conference. It is it's clear that from all the discussions that we've heard today, from the questions that we've had, and from the results to the polls that we showed, that a small step in the right direction has been made by promotion, but that real progress depends on action by all of us, and mostly regarding coordination and creating a long-term vision. So this means that we really need to reach out to each other in the stakeholder community across national and organizational boundaries to find some common ground and start building this common vision from there. In doing so, it is important to always keep the benefit to the European consumer. This could be in low energy costs or in the increased number of jobs that we will have in the backs of our minds, and communicate this as clearly as we can to garner the public support that we need to realize this vision. There's a huge amount of work to be done by us all. So before we finish, I will just limit myself to a word of thanks. I would like to thank you, the audience, for your attention and your interest over the last 4.5 years in the promotion project. I would also like to thank all the colleagues from all of the promotion partners who have contributed to promotion over the last 4.5 years. Personally, I've very much enjoyed all the conversations, the meetings in different European locations. It's been a pleasure to work with you and get to know you. A special word of thanks goes to all the work package leaders who have been extremely active and supportive, and whose passionate and pragmatic insight have helped shape the project into what it is today. And of course, finally, ultimately, I would like to thank the EU for all of the support, both financially, but also from an organizational perspective and political perspective in making this happen and making promotion a reality. So please visit our website. All of the work that we've done that is publicly available is available on the website. Also, the recordings and movies from the breakout sessions and from today's session will be available there. And we will remain at your disposal if you have any further questions or wish to know more about any details in our project. So with that, I would like to close today and wish you all a good remainder of the day and hope to see you in real life soon. Thank you very much.